Summer, 1940. Britain is burning. Cities tremble beneath the roar of German bombers. Every dawn brings black smoke and silence where homes once stood. The Luftwaffe dominates the skies. Faster, stronger, relentless. The world calls it hopeless. Britain stands alone, waiting for defeat to fall from above. But in a quiet hangar, beneath the thunder of sirens and the hum of desperation, a small group of engineers work on what everyone calls impossible. A plane too fast to outfly, too agile to outgun, too bold to exist. This is the story of the Spitfire, the miracle of metal and will, and the dying man whose vision gave Britain wings when the world expected it to fall. The story begins not in the heat of war, but in the quiet gray of the 1930s, a time when Britain was still haunted by the ghosts of the Great War. The world had changed, yet its leaders still believed the next battle would be fought in trenches, not in the skies. But one man refused to look backward. His name was Reginald Joseph Mitchell, R.J. Mitchells, a thin, sharp-eyed engineer from Staffordshire who spoke little and dreamed big. He wasn't a general, not a politician, not even a soldier. He was an engineer, one obsessed with perfection. And in his mind, flight was the future of survival. Mitchell worked for Supermarine, a small company known for building seaplanes, not fighters. But to him, the sea wasn't the limit. It was a testing ground. His obsession with speed began with the Schneider Trophy races, the elite competitions that turned aviation into an art of precision Britain had to win, and Mitchell's sleek silver machines, like knives cutting through wind, brought victory home. His racing seaplane, the S-6B, broke world records and captured something deeper than glory. It proved that beauty and power could coexist in flight. That same curve of wing and balance of speed would one day become the silhouette of the Spitfire. But no one knew that yet. Still, Mitchell's dream came at a cost. His health was failing. Long hours, endless sketches, and the heavy air of his workshop drained him. In 1933, he received the diagnosis that changed everything. Cancer. The doctors gave him months, maybe a year. But instead of retreating, he grew colder, more focused, as if time itself had become his enemy. "If I can give this country a fighter that will win the next war," he once said, "I shall have done something worthwhile." He didn't build to survive, he built so Britain could. By 1934, storm clouds gathered again over Europe. Germany rearmed, the Luftwaffe rising like a mechanical storm. The RAF, however, was still flying slow, outdated biplanes. Relics of a dying age, Mitchell watched them with disgust. He wanted something new, something faster than sound, sharper than wind. He began sketching, night after night, the shape that would haunt him until his final breath: smooth, elliptical wings. A body that looked alive, almost organic. No wasted lines, no hesitation. Every bolt, every curve built for speed. But in Whitehall's polished corridors, his ideas were dismissed. Too expensive, too radical, too ambitious. They said it couldn't be built, that the elliptical wings were too complex, the design too fragile. One RAF official called it a dreamer's folly. Yet Mitchell didn't argue. He simply returned to his desk and kept drawing. He believed in what the numbers whispered, that this plane could climb faster, turn tighter, and outfly anything Germany could create. His small team at Supermarine believed too. They worked in secrecy and sweat, testing, braking, rebuilding. The airfield smelled of oil and rain, the sound of hammers echoing through long nights. Mitchell watched from the edge of the hangar, wrapped in his coat, coughing into his handkerchief, blood hidden beneath his calm. He was dying, but his creation was coming alive. When the first prototype rolled out, it looked unlike anything the RAF had ever seen. Streamlined, elegant, powerful. A machine that seemed more like a living creature than cold steel. Its name? The Spitfire, a word chosen for its spirit, its sting, its defiance. It wasn't yet perfect, not even close. But when the engine roared to life, the sound shook the air. A growl of defiance against inevitability. Mitchell watched it take off for the first time, eyes unblinking as it lifted from the runway and vanished into the mist. In that moment, he didn't see a plane, he saw a promise. That even as one life faded, another could rise in its place. a promise that when Britain would one day stand alone, this creation, his creation, would be there to defend it. He walked away from the airfield slowly that day, exhausted, weak, but smiling. The impossible had taken flight. By the time the first Spitfire prototype, the K-5054, touched the clouds over Southampton in 1936, the world was already changing faster than anyone could imagine. The air was heavy with the sound of new engines. Germany's Messerschmitts, sleek and deadly, now prowled European skies. To the men who gathered on that windswept airfield, the Spitfire was more than just a test machine. It was hope, carved from aluminum and willpower. The prototype soared with a grace that stunned everyone watching. It wasn't just fast, it danced through the sky. Pilots described it as an extension of thought, responding to every movement with almost human instinct. When it landed, even the most skeptical engineers stood in silence. The impossible had worked. But success in war is never born easily. The Air Ministry, slow and cautious as always, demanded revisions. They wanted changes. Hundreds of them. More armor, a stronger engine, easier maintenance. Mitchell's team was drowning in bureaucracy before they could even begin production. But the real battle wasn't with the government. It was inside Mitchell's own body. His cancer was spreading. The pain came in waves, but he refused to stop. He returned to the workshop each morning, face pale, steps slower, eyes still burning with that same relentless fire. In the hangars of Supermarine, the nights were long and full of noise. Metal clanging, the crack of rivet guns, the rasp of sandpaper smoothing curved wings. The smell of sweat and oil mixed with cigarette smoke as engineers worked shoulder to shoulder, knowing every hour mattered. Mitchell often sat on a stool in the corner, sketchbook in hand, coughing quietly into a handkerchief already stained with blood. He refused to show weakness. Not to his men, not to himself. He once whispered, "We haven't time to be afraid." And then came the test flights that nearly ended everything. The second prototype, overloaded, unbalanced, crashed during a maneuver. The pilot barely escaped with his life. Critics returned, louder than ever. The RAF considered canceling the project entirely. But for every failure, Mitchell had an answer. He adjusted the wings, modified the propeller, pushed the Rolls-Royce engineers to perfect their new engine, the Merlin. It would become the beating heart of the Spitfire, a sound that would one day echo across Britain's skies like thunder and defiance. As months turned into years, the war drew closer. The newspapers were filled with Hitler's speeches and Europe's collapse. Yet inside that small British factory, something extraordinary was happening. Ordinary men and women, from machinists to secretaries, were building the future one rivet at a time. The hum of their labor was not just the sound of industry, it was the heartbeat of resistance before the first bomb had even fallen. Mitchell, frail now, oversaw his final prototype in 1937. The pain had become unbearable, but he still insisted on reviewing every bolt, every curve. The team knew he didn't have long. One morning, too weak to stand, he was brought to the airfield to see his creation fly again. The Spitfire leapt into the sky, silver against the gray, and for a moment all the noise of the world seemed to fade. The plane tilted, rolled, climbed. Mitchell's lips curved into a faint smile. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, "I think we got it right." A few months later, R.J. Mitchell died at only 42 years old. He never lived to see war come, never heard the name Spitfire whispered with reverence by pilots who owed their lives to it. But in his final moments, he had built something greater than metal. He had built faith. Faith that speed, courage, and imagination could still stand against tyranny. His death left a silence in the workshop. Yet the men he trained carried his voice in their hands. His successor, Joseph Smith, vowed to finish what Mitchell began, to perfect the Spitfire, to make it not just fast, but unstoppable. When war finally erupted in 1939 and the German blitzkrieg tore through Europe, Britain would look to the ski, and waiting there, gleaming under the clouds, would be Mitchell's legacy. The plane they once said was impossible. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood utterly alone. France had fallen. Europe had been crushed beneath the heel of the Luftwaffe. And now the last free nation faced the storm. Every day, the wail of air raid sirens echoed through London streets. The skies above the Channel turned black with German bombers, Heinkels, Dorniers, and the lethal Messerschmitt Bf-1009s that guarded them like wolves circling prey. The British Isles were next, and the only thing standing between Hitler's air armada and the fall of Britain were a handful of young pilots, and R.J. Mitchell's Spitfire. They called them the Few. Many were barely out of school, their hands still trembling when they touched the throttle. They came from farms, factories, even foreign lands. Czechs, Poles, Canadians, Australians, all drawn to the call to defend a nation that refused to bow. Their world was the cockpit, a confined cage of steel and glass where life and death hung by a thread of skill and seconds. And when the Luftwaffe came, it came like thunder. Dogfights erupted over the white cliffs of Dover, over the rolling fields of Kent, over burning cities. The sky became a battlefield of smoke trails and shattered engines. Amid this case, the Spitfire revealed its soul. It wasn't just fast. It was alive. It could twist, climb, dive, and turn tighter than anything Germany had built. Pilots described it as flying on instinct. They could feel every vibration through the stick, every heartbeat of the engine, as if the plane itself were breathing beside them. The Merlin engine screamed across the horizon, its roar answering the growl of the Messerschmitts. In those moments, the Spitfire became more than a machine. It was Britain's defiance made visible, its wings stretched against extinction. A pilot once said, "When you flew a Spitfire, you didn't feel fear. You felt purpose." Yet behind the glory, there was terror. Fuel lines burst, guns jammed. Pilots who took off at dawn never returned. In hangars across southern England, mechanics worked by lantern light, patching bullet holes with trembling hands. Oil dripped from torn fuselages onto cold concrete floors. Every repaired plane meant one more chance for survival. Every spare part was a prayer. And still the Luftwaffe kept coming. London burned, Coventry burned. The night sky pulsed red from the fires below. Children slept in underground stations, while above them the war raged unseen. But somewhere high over the Channel, the Spitfires kept rising. Their silhouettes flashed across the clouds like silver ghosts, darting through smoke and sunlight, striking with impossible precision. Before vanishing again, the Germans began to fear them. Luftwaffe aces who once mocked the British now called the Spitfire the demon in the wind. Its agility was unmatched, its speed a deadly whisper. Even Goering, watching from across the Channel, demanded to know why his best pilots were dying to those damn Spitfires. But the truth was brutal. The Spitfire alone could not win the war. It could only buy time. Time for radar to detect incoming raids. Time for Britain to rebuild, reload, and breathe. Its pilots fought in shifts of exhaustion and adrenaline, often scrambling multiple times a day. They landed only to refuel and reload before taking off again. Their faces were blackened with oil and sweat, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Still, they fought. In those endless dogfights, one thing became clear. The Spitfire wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the heartbeat of resistance. Every climb, every dive, every narrow escape carried the spirit of its dying creator, R.J. Mitchell, the man who had once said, "We haven't time to be afraid." By September 1940, the Battle of Britain reached its breaking point. Germany threw everything it had into one final assault, launching wave after wave of bombers. For hours, the skies above London were filled with the roar of engines and the thunder of flak. But the Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet them again, battered, outnumbered, but unbroken. And then, something miraculous happened. The tide turned. The Luftwaffe began to falter, losing more planes than they could replace. The impossible had happened. Britain had survived. The Spitfire, once mocked and doubted, had become legend. And as the last German bombers limped home across the Channel, the world realized something profound. That courage, when fused with invention, can change the course of history. But the war was far from over. Britain had won the sky, but the darkness that followed would test even the bravest hearts. The Spitfire had given them hope. Now it had to help them endure. The Battle of Britain had ended, but the war pressed on like a storm without rest. Europe was still enslaved, and Hitler's army stood unbroken across the continent. Yet for the first time, the tide had shifted. The impossible plane that Britain once doubted had proven itself, not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of survival. The Spitfire had become the nation's heartbeat, its wings carrying the weight of every hope left in the free world. Factories across Britain worked through the night. The clang of hammers echoed against concrete walls, sparks flying as welders repaired wings and engines. Young women in overalls riveted panels by candlelight, their faces streaked with oil and determination. The Spitfire was no longer the dream of a single engineer. It was now the creation of an entire people. Every rivet carried a fingerprint, every engine a story. Britain was building not just airplanes, but defiance itself. The pilots, the few, or Sabawasha, returned to their bases each dawn, exhausted and changed. The joy of victory had been replaced by the silence of absence. Empty chairs in mess halls, lockers never reopened, names crossed off in ledgers. The Spitfire had won the skies, but the price was written in blood. They had seen friends vanish in a blink of fire, swallowed by the sea, or buried beneath the fields they once flew over. And yet, they climbed back into the cockpit every time, because someone had to. As the war dragged on, the Spitfire evolved. Engineers kept improving its wings, its guns, its range, each variant born from desperation and courage. The Merlin engine roared louder, propelling it faster, higher, deadlier. When the Luftwaffe changed tactics, the Spitfire adapted. It intercepted bombers, guarded convoys, and faced the new German Focke-Wulfs with unflinching ferocity. Even in North Africa, over desert heat and burning dunes, the Spitfire found new life, its silhouette cutting through sandstorms as British pilots battled for air supremacy over Tobruk and El Alamein. But behind every battle and every flight test, there was the ghost of one man, R.J. Mitchell. His name, once known only in design offices, had become whispered like legend among pilots and engineers alike. They called his Spitfire Mitchell's dream, though he never lived to see it fight. In the hum of every engine, his spirit lingered, the man who had built perfection not for glory, but for necessity. His work had given his country the one weapon it needed most: time. Time to endure, time to fight, time to hope. In those years of darkness, the Spitfire became more than metal. It became art in motion, a poem of engineering born from fear and faith. Its elliptical wings sliced through sunlight like a bird of prey, graceful yet lethal. War correspondents wrote of its beauty, of how it looked almost too delicate for battle. But that was the irony. Beauty had become Britain's weapon. In its curves and roar lay something the enemy could never understand: a quiet, relentless belief in freedom. The airfields that once seemed desolate were now sacred ground. Mechanics saluted each departing pilot as though sending off a piece of their own soul. Civilians watched from the cliffs as Spitfires traced the horizon, their contrails like brushstrokes of defiance across a gray sky. Each flight reminded Britain and the world that machines, when guided by courage, could become miracles. And still, through the smoke and rubble, through the blackouts and sirens, the Spitfire remained. When the Blitz turned London to ash, it soared. When the enemy returned, it rose to meet them again. It was a whisper from the heavens saying, "We are still here, but even legends fade." And by 1944, new aircraft, faster, stronger, heavier, began to take its place. The war had changed. Technology had raced ahead, and jet engines loomed on the horizon. Yet, even as the Spitfire aged, it never became obsolete. It adapted, fought, and endured until the very end. Until peace finally silenced the skies. By the time the guns went quiet in 1945, thousands of Spitfires had been built, and thousands of pilots had lived and died, well, within their frames. It had become the symbol of an age, the emblem of a nation that refused to fall. From factory floors to battlefronts, from the trembling hands that built them to the fearless ones that flew them, the Spitfire had carried the soul of Britain through its darkest night. And though the war was ending, the story of the Spitfire and the man who made it was far from over. Because some creations transcend their purpose, some machines carry not just history, but humanity itself. When the war ended in 1945, the world stood in stunned silence. The guns ceased, the skies cleared, and for the first time in years, the world could hear the wind again. Britain emerged scarred but unbroken, its cities shattered but its spirit intact. Across airfields from Kent to Scotland, hundreds of Spitfires sat quietly in rows, their wings still gleaming with oil and rain. The machines that once screamed through dogfights at 20,000 feet now rested under soft gray skies, their purpose fulfilled. But their story, their legend, had only just begun. The Spitfire had done more than win battles. It had preserved the idea of freedom itself. When Britain stood alone in 1940, surrounded and outnumbered, it was this slender, almost fragile-looking fighter that changed the course of history. It wasn't built by a military empire or a vast industrial power. It was born from the hands of ordinary men and women, craftsmen, mechanics, engineers, and dreamers, who believed that perfection was worth fighting for. In those quiet post-war years, many of them returned to normal life. The pilots who had been hailed as heroes became farmers, teachers, and fathers. The mechanics went back to factories, the engineers to offices. But none of them ever forgot the sound of that engine, the deep, rolling hum of the Merlin that had once been the pulse of survival. They said that when a Spitfire flew overhead after the war, everything stopped. Conversations fell silent, heads turned, and for a brief moment, people remembered who they had been when the world was at its darkest. For R.J. Mitchell, the man whose vision made it all possible, there would be no celebration. He had died in 1937, 3 years before the Battle of Britain, never knowing that his creation would save his nation. But those who worked beside him never forgot. To them, he was not just an engineer. He was a man who built hope out of aluminum and air. His son once said, "My father didn't build the Spitfire to win glory. He built it because he knew someone had to." And that, more than anything, became the story of Britain itself, a nation held together by people who simply refused to give up. As decades passed, the Spitfire became a relic, then a symbol, and finally a legend. It appeared in museums, air shows, and memorials, but also in the hearts of those who still remembered the sound of its wings cutting through the dawn. Pilots who had once fought in the Battle of Britain grew old, but when they saw a Spitfire take flight, their eyes glistened. That shape, those wings, brought back everything: the fear, the bravery, the loss, the triumph. It reminded them that they had lived through something extraordinary. Even today, when one takes to the air, crowds gather. Children watch in awe, veterans stand in silence, and for a moment, time bends backward. The roar of the Merlin echoes like a heartbeat from another age, a reminder that courage is not born from strength, but from conviction. The Spitfire remains a living ghost, a bridge between the past and the present, whispering to every generation that freedom always has a price, and that sometimes that price is paid by dreamers. It is easy now to look back and see inevitability, to believe Britain could never have fallen. But history tells another truth. It could have easily. The difference was not numbers nor weapons. It was will. It was imagination. It was one man's belief that beauty and function could coexist, that a plane designed with grace could outfly the machinery of tyranny. That belief, tested by fire, reshaped the world. And so the Spitfire endures, not just as an artifact, but as an idea. The idea that greatness can come from small workshops, that miracles can be born from necessity, that even in the bleakest hours, the spark of human ingenuity can light the sky. Because history is not written only by generals or kings. Sometimes it is written by the quiet engineer sketching wings on a notepad, by the mechanic tightening the final bolt, by the pilot whispering a prayer before takeoff. They are the ones who give us flight when all seems lost. The impossible plane that beat the Luftwaffe was never just a machine. It was a promise, forged in metal, tested in fire, and kept by a nation that refused to surrender. And even now, when a Spitfire shadow passes across the fields of England, the world remembers that there was once a time when courage alone held the sky.